how you doing out there, survivors, and welcome back to another episode of Let's Survive Interviews. I am today absolutely delighted to be joined by an incredible, interactive storyteller. Is the only way I can think of describing this man, because with the work that he does, in my opinion, kind of goes above and beyond traditional game design. You'll know his work from Silent Hill Origins, Silent Hill Shattered Memories, which is a favourite of mine, the BAFTA winning Her Story.
Triple BAFTA winning Her Story. There we go. And the incredible Telling Lies. There's many more on the plate, but those are the ones I'm going to list out. It's Mr. Sam Barlow. Thank you so much for being here. It's good to be here.
So Sam, right out the gate, as I say, I've been a fan of yours for quite a long time. Probably was a fan of yours before I necessarily knew who you were. In the sense that, you know, in the 2000s I would have played games that Climax were making, like Serious Sam: The Next Encounter, and stuff like that, not necessarily knowing that you were the creative lead behind games like that and Crusty Demons and stuff. But what I'll ask is, you kind of started out in the industry where you'd kind of go, in the sense that with kind of interactive fiction. So I'd love, like, you started out with a little game called Isle. So I'd love to just know a little bit about, like, how you came up with that game and you're kind of starting the industry.
I'm going to try not to do the long version of this. I'll do this, not even the medium version. Short version is, okay, this is the short version. I was born, but I grew up, I guess when I was, 9 or 10, we got an Amstrad CPC home computer or whatever. I went to a very strange school when I was, at some point, my family lived in Tanzania in Africa because my dad was a road engineer. We moved back to the UK to this small village where the village school was so small, they only had one girl, and she was the head teacher's daughter, and they lived in the school. And this head teacher was very eccentric, and he was obsessed with D.H. Lawrence. So he used to just, it was like one of these inspirational Hollywood movies. He would like tear up the textbooks and say, just go and play in the woods. But for all his eccentricity, he would also sign up for any scheme going. So like, we were the first school in the county or whatever to have a computer. We had like a little, I don't even know what it was. I don't even think it was a BBC, but it was some very early computer that would just sit, and each kid was allowed like an hour on it a week. And I remember there was a text game about being on an island or something that I would obsess over and think about. So I grew up loving video games, and as a kid as well, like my early creative writing was done within games. Like I would write terrible little text adventures for my friends and stuff. So I was always like really interested in that world, but growing up in my family, nobody kind of had like a creative career in their head. It never occurred to me that you could get a job making video games, do any of this stuff. So at some point I go to university and I do sent off to do physics, because that seemed like a very sensible thing to do. But at the time I was doing lots of painting and writing and stuff, which was explained to me like, this is a cool hobby to have whilst you go and get a degree in physics and get a proper job. And it was at university that discovered like the early internet. This was like Mosaic browser, Usenet groups. Through that, discovered this incredible kind of mid to late 90s interactive fiction scene, which was in a large part a lot of other people at universities and colleges around the world. And it was this wonderful group of people who had this kind of sweet spot of enough of a right brain to be able to log into an FTP and download like the tools to make a piece of interactive fiction, but enough of a left brain that they really wanted to write interactive fiction and figure out what are cool things we can do with storytelling in this medium. So that was like a very, very cool little community. There are people like Adam Kadra, Andrew Plotkin, Emily Short, John Ingold, who now kind of founded Inkle. They made like 80 Days, Heaven's Vault, was part of that scene. And there was this annual competition that every year people would, it was kind of a good excuse to force people to finish games or do cool games, and continues to this day, and the numbers increase and increase every year. And I was like, oh, I should enter this thing because this is what you do. And I wrote this game that wasn't great. And the week before the submission, like my floppy disk died or something that had the backup. And I remember rewriting it in like a week, and I didn't test it, and it was not great. But a few people liked it and it did okay. But I remember being so ashamed that this game had issues and wasn't great, and I hadn't tested it. And I was like, okay, my next one, I got to do something really cool. And that became Isle. And this isn't the short answer, is it? The jumping off point for Isle was, as someone that had a profound love for like classic text adventures, the games by Infocommon people, like as a kid, at that time, you were looking at video games, and a lot of things were cartoony platformers, and all the games of the time. But then these Infocom text games were like aimed at grown-ups, and there were like murder mysteries and detective things and horror things. Like Lurking Horror was incredible. The Magnetic Scrolls in the UK were doing things like Corruption, which within the first 5 minutes you've grabbed some cocaine and there's like marital affairs and things. So loved all that stuff. And this new scene that I discovered, this interactive fiction scene, was very cool because everyone had this nostalgia for those games, but they were also trying to do these really interesting storytelling things. But that combination would occasionally annoy me because there was a thing where if you're making a text game, especially a classic text game, the way you prove to the audience that you've implemented things thoroughly, that this is a polished game, is by having lots of responses to everything you can type. And the tradition is that those are normally slightly funny. And if you think like graphic adventures, the good ones are all comedies because it allows you to kind of explain away the things that don't work, or the silliness inherent in it. So there's this kind of tradition where when you boot up a classic text game, to sort of see how polished it is, you deliberately type silly things or dumb things. You type things that are entirely against the spirit of the narrative. So, for example, I'd play a game like So Far by Andrew Plotkin, which at the time was this kind of, everyone was comparing it to Bergman, and the way it combined fantasy with these kind of this psychological storytelling. But I would boot it up, and you meet an important character or something. The first thing you try and do is kill them or kiss them, and
I was going to say,
tear off your clothes or type in curse words or whatever.
That's the
and I kind of hated this because it was so childish and disrespectful and silly. It'd be like going to see a really serious movie and sitting down, and people are just like constantly,
making fart noises throughout,
gags or whatever, right? But I did it myself. Like it was a natural instinct. So the very germ of Isle was, what if I make a game that punishes people for doing this? Like, what is the game where if I tell the character to randomly kiss or kill somebody, it's like, okay, instead of giving you a funny response, it's like, I'm going to do it. And then you get the story you deserve. And off of that, very quickly came, well, what is the most mundane setting in which to put this scenario so that these consequences feel more interesting? I was like, I'll stick it in a supermarket in the pasta aisle. And then once I started kind of playing with the idea, this feature that is a big part of what became Isle was, well, if I have to implement all these things that are happening, that's very hard. But what if I make this a one-turn game? Like you type something and it happens and the story goes in a direction and then it finishes and you restart. So that I can literally respond to anything people can think of and still implement this thing. And then from that, you start in having interesting things of, discovering information through an exploratory
Yeah.
action that then you can feed back in, so you can start typing in words that don't exist in this initial text that you've discovered, and from there, like, it was interesting. It kind of evolved from testing it with people, seeing what answers they wanted. It kind of took on this interesting shape. So it was a good analysis of it that talked about a kind of arc for the player of sort of starting off typing all the more violent, silly things, and kind of by the end of it, working to come up with actions which would actually create a happy story, and kind of connect this character. And there are ways of engineering the story in a more happy way, and they kind of took the message of the piece from that, which was quite interesting. But that was, so I made this text game whilst I was at university, very much in the spirit of this was a hobbyist thing I was doing. Everyone else in the interactive scene at the time, although there was like a recurring question of like, oh, couldn't we make interactive fiction commercial again?
Yeah.
And we all knew that was a ridiculous idea. Perhaps not that ridiculous these days.
I was just going to say, if you flash forward 20 years.
At the time, it was like, this is quaint, but the world has moved on. So I was doing all that, and so I was really interested in interactive storytelling, partly because that was kind of just something I'd grown up with as being a constant presence. But it was something that was very interesting to me, playing with the relationship between the player and the storyteller, sometimes in a kind of adversarial way, in a more interesting way. But after that, I went off and I ended up finishing my degree as a math degree, because physics, I didn't realize this whole thing of doing physics at university would mean spending hours in a laboratory playing with an oscilloscope. Whereas my friends that were doing like English degrees, they were like, I have 3 hours a week and I have to read books. And I was like, this sucks. So I switched over to maths, which was more interesting to me because I kind of picked all the more weird philosophical maths. Finished that, and then was kind of at a loss once I finished what I should do for a career. And so I took a job in the States with this, and this probably set me up for her story, who knows, this weird database business intelligence company that was in the States, because they kind of came around the university and they did this thing where they gave you free food and alcohol to like come to their careers spiel. So the flat I was living in, we would go to these things every night because it was free food and alcohol. And we went to this one, and it was like, oh, these are like these weird Americans and they're talking a good game, and the guy that runs it sounds very eccentric. He was like a very Elon Musk style tech billionaire kind of guy, and I had nothing else to do, so I was like, I'll take this job because they were paying lots of money, and it was working for this eccentric tech guy. So I thought it will at least venture. Went off and did that, and like not too long into that, there was some weird malarkey with how they were stating their revenue, which caused some issues, and they shut down my my department because we were the kind of funkiest department, so they wanted to show that they were actually a very well behaved grown-up company. I took like another job that was another kind of tech company. At some point their checks started bouncing, so I came back to the UK and was in this weird limbo. But like I was too experienced to be a graduate hire, but not experienced enough in anything useful to be a useful hire. So kind of kept being sent to interview at .com companies the week before they shut down. At some point, I had a friend who was like, do you know what? This is like a friend I grew up with. He was like, I'm doing programming for this video games company. You do art. Like, why don't you be a video game artist? And I was like, oh, okay. And like spent a week. I downloaded like cracked versions of Maya and all the different software. Very quickly created a video game artist portfolio that, thank God, this was just the right time where you could put something on the internet and it doesn't exist anymore now. Like, I think, it wasn't captured anywhere. It's not been archived. So this portfolio of mine does not exist. But that got me, and I applied to like every company in the UK, I think. I think I was reasonably aggressive. And I got one interview, which was at Climax, because they were making this Serious Sam game. And I'd put in some like Quake levels. And so I was hired as an artist on Serious Sam. And then very quickly, I wouldn't stop talking in design meetings. So they made me a designer. And then I still wouldn't stop talking. So then they made me a lead designer.
So the advice is don't stop talking.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah. And so then I was kind of in the video games industry, kind of without thinking about it. And just kind of making games, and very much, I don't know if this exists anymore as a thing, but certainly that era, like the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 era, that, movie tie-ins, all the kind of licensed games was like this whole tier of games that kind of trained people up. Like so many people that worked with me or for me at Climax went on to go work at Naughty Dog, or to go over to like BioWare or whatever. Like this was a great place where you'd come in and have to make a game in like a year, just get it done. So there was some very good work that was done, and it was a very great place to kind of train up and learn your trade. So I was working there, and at some point through interesting circumstances and lots of other people's mistakes and lots of luck, got to work on Silent Hill. And that was kind of the ticket where at some point, once we were up and running on that, I kind of stopped and went, this is probably the job that I wanted to do back from, all the way back, but never articulated or realized I wanted to do. Or
even how you could get there. Like you didn't know.
Yeah.
What?
I'm terrible. People ask me now, like, oh, how do you get a job in the games industry? I'm like, don't listen to me. Like,
that's step one. Now. Step one.
Everyone I knew when I started out, everyone got there through very random things. There was lots, there were a lot of people were hired from just doing like Counter-Strike mods. But there were people that, were just met someone in a pub and they were like, oh, come and work for us. Like it was a very different time. There were no qualifications.
It's kind of like the film industry to some extent, because I've seen that a lot with the film industry since I started making films in 2015, is that you get people like Fede Alvarez, who did the Evil Dead remake, who made a short film, put it online, thinking nothing of it, woke up the next morning and it had millions of views. Kanye West had retweeted it, and then he got a call and was like, come to LA, went to the bathroom in this party, met someone who said, you're going to direct the Evil Dead remake, and then directed the Evil Dead remake. It's just... You can't... Fede Alvarez cannot tell somebody how to get a job in the film industry, because it was just a bizarre... All he did was make a really good short film, so that's step one, is make something of worth, and then hopefully that will lead to other things. Because, with you, for example, starting out with Isle, which has a certain amount of notoriety now, even when I was speaking to one of my friends and I said I was getting you on the show, he was like, dude, have you played Isle? And I won't lie to you, I hadn't, at the time. And so then I was like, no, I haven't. He was like, grab it, it's online, check it out. So I picked it up, and and I was like, wow, this is... You could see the threads of other stuff that you'd go on to do already there. Like that idea, like you said, of kind of going back and trying things a different way, or, just examining it from every possible angle, which I think... I was going to ask you about, why you chose interactive media as opposed to kind of traditional media, like film or... writing, but I think if you look at Isle, you can see that what interests... Well, this is my reading of you, so you can tell me if I'm wrong 100%, but because it's you after all. But the idea I have is that you like giving people a perspective that they don't get in other mediums.
Yeah, like I say, I think it wasn't even necessarily that I made a choice at a particular point. Like I say, I was writing, and like, you know, so me and my friends would write these text games for each other, and because they were for an audience of a very small audience of each other, and we were young boys, like we would write these games where set up for Alex. So I'd make a game where you're playing as Alex trying to get laid. And that's like the quest of the game. But every step you take towards that, you fail awfully because you're a terrible human being, and the game tells you that. So there was like just this idea of this extremely adversarial relationship between the game and the player, like, was interesting to me. And yeah, I mean, I grew up playing games, and, you know, probably when I was reasonably young, the more sophisticated fiction I read probably was some of these text adventures and Infocom things. And then I started reading proper books and stuff. But, you know, that was always there in my head. And so, yeah, when I was at university, there was something beautiful as well about that moment in interactive fiction where, and it's slightly different now, but then if you wanted to make a video game, you'd have had to pay $2 million to license the engine. You know, you couldn't. If you wanted to, you know, make a movie, yes, you could, you know, get a small handheld camera or whatever, but still there was a lot of effort involved. But writing a piece of interactive fiction, you know, you can sit down and write 100 spaceships crashed, and, you know, people ran screaming, and that's free. It doesn't cost you anything.
Exactly. No visual effects budget.
it was very cool that you could create this whole experience as a single individual, and then there was a place to share it by uploading it online. Obviously, back then, if you wanted to download a game off the internet, it probably had to be pretty small file size wise. I mean, that was back when I remember plugging my phone in and having to pay like an extra 50 pounds on the phone bill because I wanted to download some game demo or something. So it was a really interesting sweet spot where you could create something and share it with people. And you know, obviously we take that for granted now with the internet and how things work, but that was quite a little sweet spot. So I think, obviously I was predisposed to doing that kind of thing. I remember my parents had a Kit Williams book as a kid. Kit Williams was this artist who created this series of puzzle books. I think Masquerade was the famous one, where he buried a golden hare. He had this extremely expensive golden hare, buried it somewhere in the UK, and then created this book that contained clues to find it. And it was this huge viral, I don't think they called it viral then, but like this big viral thing where everyone went out and bought this book to try and solve it. And it was really sad, actually. What happened was his ex-girlfriend, her new boyfriend, was basically kind of grilling her for hints. And he kind of reverse engineered where he thought the hair was buried based on things that she remembered about her relationship. And this guy turned up knowing he'd pretty much decided it was in this village. It was somewhere in this village, somewhere in the UK. And he would go there every night with a metal detector, just digging the hell up out of this village until he found it. He then found it and like declared he'd won it and was celebrated as the winner of this thing that everyone was very excited about. But there was like a general confusion of like, what exactly was his solution? And he didn't necessarily know like how he had solved this. So then there was like a bit of a controversy, and it kind of ruined the fun of it all for everybody.
Yeah. He was like the Veruca Salt in this Willy Wonka scenario, just buying all the chocolate bars.
And then like I think a year later, someone actually solved it for real. But like I had that book, and as a kid, I didn't even know the story behind it. It was just super interesting. It was this weird book with all these mysteries and stuff. So yeah, and I've had kind of opportunities since, especially like after her story, to go do linear things. Right. And it's always seemed like not necessarily the less interesting, but probably the less challenging choice. Also, I'm aware that there are lots of people creating linear content. And so
yeah, it definitely makes it a lot more not challenging, but it makes it, getting eyes on it is quite difficult.
I have a friend who is an author, and every time, I haven't done this for a while, but prior to the pandemic, every time I walked into a bookshop, I'd just be like, there's so many books.
Yeah.
So many new books, and I haven't read any of the old ones. Like, I've read 1% of all the old books. And they keep making them. Like, it just terrifies me, the idea of trying to put a book out.
That's the feeling, the experience that I had. I mean, with my film went out on the 7th of April on VOD. It was meant to have like a slightly bigger release. I was supposed to go to LA in April and have our premiere at the Chinese Man Theatre, and it was going to be great and wonderful and everything. And then it was like, oh, you're not flying. Like, you're not going anywhere, bucko. Sit down. And then it went straight on VOD, and that was my moment of like opening Amazon Prime, being like, my movie's on Amazon Prime, and I'm like, I can't even find my movie. Where the hell is my movie? And so yeah, it was a moment of going like, wow, there's a lot of stuff out here that you're really up against. It doesn't matter if you're in a niche genre or anything. It's like, no, there's even in niche genres, there's hundreds of thousands of things.
Yeah.
But I guess, I don't know, for me, I was saying this in another interview, but I guess I kind of transitioned from video game development into filmmaking, and I kind of know what I'm dealing with. As in, I'm making films because I enjoy going out with my friends and making movies, and it's not necessarily, while I don't consider it a hobby, I also don't think this is going to be my be all and end all unless I get very lucky, because I always say this, it's a lot of hard work, but then there has to be a spark of luck as well.
I mean, it's all luck, right? We have this wonderful survivor bias thing. The example I love is like Charles Dickens, right? Charles Dickens was a very good writer. And so people look at his books and go, oh, Charles Dickens was an incredibly good writer. That's why he was so successful. But then you look and you go, well, actually, there were lots of other very good writers. And in fact, there were lots of other writers who were far more successful at the time than Charles Dickens. But for some reason, he's persisted. And so really, yeah, the entry point is, yes, you have to be a very good writer. Yes, you have to create something interesting. Yes, you have to have whatever talent. But what happens after that is where the luck comes. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I see it a lot in film as well, in that, like, there's a movie from, I think it's 1982, called Night Beast, which was shot by a guy for, like, I don't know, $6,000 in his backyard, by him and a bunch of mates on Super 8. And this film has been dormant for coming up on 40 years. And then somebody found it and went on a podcast and was like, I watched this movie called Night Beast. You gotta see it. I think it's only on VHS. Within a week of that, it got a DVD Blu-ray release through one of the bigger companies. And now people are going around wearing Night Beast t-shirts and being like, it became this thing that suddenly everybody had to see because... And I'm
Some of that stuff is cool.
Insane,
have you read the book The Watcher by, I think, Charles McLean?
No.
So this is a book that I think was out of print, and I don't know when it came out. My sense is maybe it was in the 80s. And oh god, who's the guy? He's like a real aficionado of horror and stuff. He's written. Did he write Sherlock? Is it Mark Gatiss? Maybe.
Gatiss sounds familiar.
It's one of those League of Extraordinary Gentlemen people.
Yeah.
That is kind of this, does lots of things. But he did it. It was like just a column, I think, in The Guardian that was my top 5 horror novels of all time. And his number 1 was this book, The Watcher, that no one had particularly heard of that much. And he was like, you've got to read this book. It's incredible. It will blow your mind. I've read nothing like it ever. And within an hour of that Guardian article, it was going for like $9,000 on, Amazon or whatever. And I had a friend who I think managed to get a copy. like, because he had read this article and like 5 seconds later he had bought a copy of it. But he was like, "Oh my God, you've got to read this book." But then I think it wasn't that long, maybe 6 months later, they brought out an ebook of it.
Okay, yeah.
You know, and it is an incredibly weird. Yeah, if you're listening to this, I think Charles McLean, The Watcher.
I must check it out.
It starts here and goes here, and it doesn't stop. Like it just goes for it. It's quite memorable. But I love that. Like I remember as a kid being obsessed with the idea of Van Gogh, right? And I think the story is slightly more complicated than the general fair. You know, the cartoon version we have of it. Oh, there's this guy who was a genius, never sold a painting, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think it was quite as bad as that, but that idea that he's just there making this stuff and it's not working for him and he dies, and now you're discovering it. Like I always had like this childish fantasy of like taking a time machine back to bring Van Gogh and be like, look,
yeah,
it worked, right? But it's kind of, I mean, it is interesting when we just have so much content that you're still able to discover things and pull them up and see them. And the like I saw the movie, Barbara Loden's movie, Wanda, which was like one of the kind of few examples at that time of like a female director in, it was either the late 60s or the early 70s, putting out a film. And obviously it had not been in circulation, had, you know, been out of print or whatever. And I think Criterion picked it up, and then there was a kind of re-release in cinemas like 2 years back. And just, you watch something like that, and there's an extra excitement to not the discovery necessarily, but the freshness of it, because this is not a classic that you've been hit over the head with again and again.
Exactly.
Like my kids, they started watching 2001 the other day, and they're like 10 and 12. And I just started showing it to them, and they were intrigued because it was some of the zero G effects shot at the start.
Incredible.
They couldn't figure out how it was done, and I was like, oh no, I was like, they literally had this whole thing on a centrifuge. Like, oh, this is, and they were really intrigued and wanted to watch the rest of it. And I was like, we can, but we need like 3 hours. But also, I know when they watch it and it gets to open the pod bay doors howl, they'll be like, that's what Siri says. They'll be like, that's the funny thing Siri does, right? All these, so there's a lot of classics that it's almost hard to actually fully come to because you have all the baggage.
Yeah, because you've been, as you said, beat over the head with it. And yeah, it's funny because, like, I think, as you say, I have friends that do this horror podcast, and every week they do a deep cut segment where they go back and find stuff. And what I love is they always say, and it's so true, they're like, the great thing about this is that we think we've seen everything, but every week we find 2 to 4 new things that we haven't seen. And it just goes to show you, as you say, that it doesn't matter how much of an expert or a thought leader you are, or you think you are in anything. There's just so much out there that it's almost impossible to ever be like.
I went down this rabbit hole when I first showed her story. I had a journalist ask me, "What made you want to make an FMV game?" And at that point, I hadn't realized I'd made an FMV game. Like I'd made it and used the video for various reasons, but I hadn't stopped and thought like, oh, I'm tapping into a genre that existed. And so I went away to do my research on the FMV genre because I was like, people are going to ask me about this.
Yeah.
And I think it was PC Gamer has this column called Crapshoot or something, where they play shit old FMV games and talk about them. And there were like 1,000 entries on this column. To the point where I started to have the suspicion they were just inventing games, but they had screenshots of all these things, and it would be too much effort. And just the volume of stuff, because you think like the cute thing growing up with games was you felt like you could wrap your hands around the whole thing. Yeah, like there was a point where to have my little Amstrad CPC, I could kind of know every game that was coming out every week. And I could not necessarily play them all, although with a network of friends and tape copying facility, we could arrange it. But you had you could completely understand exactly everything that was happening. and kind of follow it. But yeah, at some point you realize, no, it's, and even I think it was the point where I stopped playing every genre. Like as a kid, if a game was good, I would just play it because it was a good game. And so I would play soccer games and racing games and golf games and whatever. I didn't necessarily have a genre preference.
Yeah, same.
So I think at some point, genre basically is a tool that you have that is like this sea of content. How am I going to navigate it, right? And,
absolutely.
And sometimes you're going to be surprised by something that's out of your genre, but it's kind of your tool as a consumer to be like, okay, I want something of that flavor today.
I've talked a bit about this to people recently, but you also a lot of people kind of make it part of their identity then as well. Like, I mean, I'm kind of guilty of that myself. I love horror, so I kind of make horror part of who I am, it feels like, you know what I mean? It's why I buy horror merch and I wear horror t-shirts, because I want to kind of everyone to know, hey, guess what? I like horror stuff. If you're a horror fan, come talk to me. The tribal aspect is kind of interesting. Yeah, I mean, not to get too profound, but, you know, why are we telling stories? You know, stories are a way of passing on knowledge, but also of like transmitting human ideas in a way that's kind of interesting. And definitely connecting people as well. Like, as in, I go to Fright Fest every year in the UK traditionally, obviously not this year. But like immediately the first year I was at Fright Fest, it was just like, it's that whole classic I found my people motif of like, I arrived at Fright Fest and was just like, all these people share the exact same loves that I do, so we will immediately get along. I almost know that right as I walk in the door of the place. And yeah, I think there's something, and it's great because you can have differing opinions and stuff on stuff, but you always know that we still share the same common threads of what we love. Or, you know, you can have conversations about, when I was 5 years old, I saw Nightmare on Elm Street. When I was, you know, everybody has their little story to tell within this community. But then I think that filters down and down, because then you have like, but are you also a gamer? Because if you're also a gamer, we have that in common as well. And then you kind of filter those little communities down until you get like your closest bunch of people, because you're joined on all these different things that you love. That's what I found from going to these events anyway. At some point you can Google whack it and you're like, oh no, I got too specific.
That's it. That's just me.
Yeah, no, it's true.
It's me. But that is cool. Like when you think I'm the only person that saw this movie, or I'm the only person that loved this thing, or and then you realize you're not. Like, I
definitely.
Guess that once the internet came along, it was a lot easier to realize that.
Absolutely. To kind of change gears a little bit here, just to kind of go back to Climax, and so you were saying like the Silent Hill property came along. And you move into that, like, and something that I appreciate is that Silent Hill Origins, it's a fantastic game. It feels very much in line with the Silent Hills that have come before it in a lot of ways, like, which makes sense because it's a prequel, so it kind of has to. But one of the things that struck me reading up about this, because I didn't know this about Silent Hill Origins, is that apparently the game was something else entirely, and you were brought in to kind of, and it goes back to what you said about the drives, the floppy drives, and having 1 week to try and pull something together. From what I've read, that's what it kind of happened to some extent with Silent Hill Origins.
Yeah, so the short version is let's try and keep the short version. You know, Konami makes Silent Hill, wonderful thing. Like the first Silent Hill is beautiful because it comes out of there's an element of certainly at that point Japanese business culture where you don't necessarily ever fire anybody. People have a job for life, and if you don't like people, you just shuffle them around and put them in jobs or things. And as I understand it, like the Silent Hill team was all the people that other people didn't want on their team.
They were the kids
would just kind of put on like go and do something over here. I'm sure someone told me that it was originally an adaptation of The Mist, the Stephen King thing, which completely made sense when you think like giant moth boss, the pterodactyl through the window, and they lost it. I'm not sure if that is true or not, but you basically had this ragtag of weirdos within Konami making this thing that fused that very kind of Western horror with their own stuff. And you had I always forget his name, but I love the guy who did the CGI. Like, no one was doing the FMV CGI stuff, and he taught himself, did it all himself, entirely on his own, was sleeping under his desk to get this done. And when you go back and replay Silent Hill 1 now, like those little movie moments, the Lynchian little things, just still pop.
They're still great, exactly, yeah.
So you had this incredible fusion. And at some point, Silent Hill has become this thing with these incredible, for the time, photorealistic characters, this incredibly deep treatment of story and character. But it stops being financially viable. Like PS2 going into PS3, to make cutting-edge CGI characters for your psychological horror, which is a niche, it doesn't make sense. So Konami dropped the franchise. They do that after 3, and then at some point they get cold feet whilst they're making 4, decide to go back because 4 originally is a new IP. They halfway through switch things around, and then after 4 is even less of a success than 3 commercially, so they're done with Silent Hill. At some point, the Silent Hill movie happens. So then you have Konami of America, who was very much a subsidiary,
an offshoot.
They weren't necessarily doing their own development a lot. It was mostly licensing and localizing things. This movie's coming out. They're like, oh my god, Silent Hill movie's coming out. We should have a Silent Hill game. And they think about it and they realize they haven't got time to do that. And I think Sony PSP at this point is coming out and is going to be this sexy thing. So they have the plan to basically load one of these little UMD discs with a load of digitized Silent Hill comics, making of trailers, just like, what have we got we can stick on this disc? And that comes out and does okay. So then they decide they're going to make a Silent Hill game. So at some point here, there's an LA office of Climax that's been set up because it's challenging as a UK independent to land business with companies that most of the big entertainment companies are, in LA, in the States. And so, there's this big gap there. So the logic was, well, if we have an LA office, we're kind of local and it's, this kind of spearhead.
Yeah.
They do 1 or 2 projects. And I believe there is some social connection, probably people in a bar in LA. So the LA Climax people get to know the Konami people and they're like, oh, we need to make a Silent Hill game. And like the producer on it is the guy who produced this UMD. So it's not like he's a experienced horror producer, Silent Hill producer. It's just like he's the guy that stuck all this stuff on the disc. So they decide they're going to make this game together. I think, I don't know if it was this time or a different time, they were thinking of just remaking Silent Hill 1. Decided that was too expensive because Silent Hill 1's quite a big game.
Yeah.
Came up with the prequel idea, and they're off to the races and they're making this game. And there was, for the short version, there were a bunch of issues with this development. So at some point, my team, who at this point were making the video game for Ghost Rider, the movie, which was a thankless task, but we did our best.
Yes.
We had a working character engine on PSP and PS2, and this team in LA didn't have a working engine. And they were supposed to be showing this game.
Oh my god!
So my team took a week to knock out a Silent Hill demo using our tech, and sent it to them and went, look, this is what it would look like in our engine. And they were like, oh, this is cool. So then I think they flew out and spent a week with us and did some tweaks, and they basically took all the code back to LA. We didn't hear from them for a while. They turned that into their idea, which was this kind of Resident Evil 4 take on Silent Hill. Had some interesting looking enemies, but it was not necessarily great. And this got shown at E3 or somewhere, this demo that was not brilliant. And they continue to develop this game. And from afar, me and my team, especially Neil Williams, who was our lead artist, and we were both huge Silent Hill fans. We were just kind of sat there going like, it's not fair. Like they're getting to work on Silent Hill. We're doing Nicolas Cage Ghost Rider. And look what they're doing. It doesn't even look like Silent Hill, right? And we would occasionally get to look at their documents, and it became apparent that there were large questions for us around their project in terms of this was a prequel, but there were characters in their prequel who were older than in the original game. Dr. Kaufman, who in the original game, is Bill Pullman from Lost Highway visually, and is seeing the supernatural for the first time. In their game 7 years prior, looks like an old man with grey hair and is fully appraised of the supernatural and explains that it is in fact quantum theory and zombies are coming through a different dimension.
Oh no. And
so we were like, this doesn't look like Silent Hill, and there's these details, and we kind of said that to our bosses, and they said, no, everyone's happy. They told us that the tone of the game was a dark comedy. They said it's like the reference was Scrubs, the TV show. Which just we were like, whoa. But at some point, it actually became apparent to the higher ups that this game wasn't looking great, was not in a great shape. And even though people at Konami had been saying it was fine, when the real grown-ups at Konami looked at it, or were about to look at it, it was not fine.
Yes.
So there was, the looming threat of painful repercussions and legal repercussions and cancellations. And we said, look, just give us just give it to us.
We'll do it, yeah.
So they said, okay, you've got it, but there's no more money or time. Like, you've just got to do it. And once we got it, the general tone was like, guys, just get this thing finished and out the door so that we don't get sued. But to me and Neil and some of the other people, we were like, this is the first Western Silent Hill.
Yeah.
Like, this can't be awful, and it can't have 7-year-old or lesser actually look like an 18-year-old, and it can't have this thing's.
And especially because it's a prequel, because you're like, this is for fans of the first game. It has to.
Yeah. And so we said, look, we need to change this, and they said, fine, but you've got to do it within the time. And so there was this accelerated thing of like rewriting the script in a week, and then after that we had to re-storyboard it, but we didn't have time to get the storyboard artist to do that, so I would take it home at night and I would draw the storyboards myself. And then we said we actually need entirely new enemies and levels and puzzles.
Jesus.
And so I was like, I did most of the new enemies. I did the first pass of the concept at home, and it was just like a lot of that going on. And the only things the two things we wanted to change that we couldn't were the main character, Travis Grady, because we looked at him, we were like, what does he have to do with Silent Hill? You're telling me the origin story of this story we know and love is that this random trucker just walks into town. I mean, just from I completely can understand why fans might not be enamored of Silent Hill Origins, because as a fan, it didn't need an origin story. Silent Hill 1 flashbacks and tells you what happened.
Yeah, no, I get it.
And interestingly, when we looked at their game, the only person who wasn't in it was Lisa, was not in their prequel. And I was like, that's the only character I have questions about, because I know what Dahlia was up to. I know what happened to Alessa. I have a sense of who Kaufman is.
Lisa was the character that was very much a mystery.
Yeah, she's like essentially a ghost in the
scene with her
original
in the first game when her eyes start bleeding and stuff, that will haunt me forever, because I just remember being like 14 and so confused and terrified.
It's great stuff. So we said we're not feeling Travis, and also they had this character who subsequently was called the Butcher, but was essentially their attempt to do an origin story for Pyramid Head.
Yes.
And we felt, as many do, that like Pyramid Head has a specific role in the story.
Yes.
And the origin story that they had was that this was a real human being who was a cannibal chef who at some point went crazy and started nailing pieces of metal to his own head. And we were like, you can't do that. Like, he has this abstract energy. He is this creature from the id. No. And so we said, look, we don't like Travis and we don't like this pyramid head thing.
Sure, yeah.
And they said, well, we've already shot the high-end CGI intro and outro. And we've already done some publicity materials with these characters. So you have to use them. So within those parameters, we tried to do our best. So like Travis Grady initially didn't really have a reason to be in the town. He had like this, at the very end, this twist that something had happened to his dad, but he would just randomly wander into locations, find a piece of the Flauros device, which I think at that point was the wrong shape as well. I was like, it's a tetrahedron or whatever. And so we looked at him and we had no time, right? So that rewriting of the script was me going, why is Travis Grady here? Why is he going to place XYZ? So the fact that his mother was there, we threw in that whole aspect. The motel, originally the motel, in their design, they didn't have a motel. They had a hotel that was haunted by zombie bellhops. And there was no story behind it. It was just a haunted hotel. And so we were like, okay, that's...
I'm sitting here as just a general Silent Hill fan, and hearing this stuff is like making me like...
Yeah, I mean, I think I was saying to someone else the other day, the work I'm most proud of, not necessarily for the end product, but knowing what we did as a team and accomplished as a team, Origins will probably forever be that piece, because we took it from here to here, and like it's completely a 7 out of 10 video game. And I feel it's an unnecessary prequel, and it doesn't add really to the mythos, and it is fan fiction within someone else's story. It's all those things, but as a game and as a project, and where we got it to, and just what we delivered in terms of the atmosphere and the visuals, and part of that was when we looked at how little time we had, and we looked at what they were doing in attempting to reconcile Resident Evil 4 with Silent Hill, plus on the PSP nubs, where you had very little fidelity, if you remember that machine.
I do, yeah.
As that it wasn't an analog stick, it was a weird nub. So throwing that into a full-on 3D aiming system was not great. So we looked at me and went, look, let's just make a classic Silent Hill game. We get that the genre itself is stagnant, but this is Silent Hill Origins. Let's make it feel like Silent Hill 1. And it's on handheld. No one had done a horror game on handheld. So we were like, can we do real-time shadows? And those things were things that we pulled off that no one else had done, where you had the the flashlight casting shadows off stuff, and it was on PSP, on handheld, great sound through the headphones. Like that was really cool.
It was one of the best looking games on the PSP. Like, I can safely say that when I had my PSP and I can pick a handful of games at that, not even at that time, but across the PSP's lifespan, it would be up there alongside something like God of War, Ghost of Sparta, and a few other titles that really stepped up to the plate visually on that platform. And the funny thing is, I'd actually agree with what you said about it kind of feeling a little bit fan-fiction-y. But I think it feels less offensive to me to have a fan-fiction-y prequel that you can kind of be like, whatever, I don't buy into that. I'm leaving that story out in my mind in canon. Versus a fan-fiction-y sequel, because there's certain series that I feel nowadays that since the original developers have moved on from those, that the developers that come in and work on those games, I feel that it feels like it goes in a fanfic, and it just makes me kind of go, well, I don't want to follow this franchise anymore because I don't like the direction it's heading. Whereas with a prequel, it doesn't really affect that. It doesn't really. It's not. Now the direction of that franchise.
Well, I think as well, it's narratively. If I have a movie I love or a story I love. In theory, the reason why prequels just suck generally, right, is when you tell a story, you're telling the most interesting part of someone's life. So, Die Hard 1 is like, this is the most intense shit that ever happened to this guy.
Yeah.
So the idea they're doing a Die Hard prequel is silly because it's like what he was doing, he did not have crazy terrorist shit happening to him before this. Like this was him going from being this guy to stepping up and becoming the Die Hard guy. So that's, it's silly, but if I love that thing, if I love Die Hard, right, or if I love, I don't know, Aliens. I mean, Aliens is a sequel, so I'm ruining my own point. But if I love a character and I love the journey they've gone on, what sticks with me is the end of that movie, right? It's the destination they got to.
Yeah.
If you throw all sorts of prequel nonsense, it doesn't really change that because it's noise before your story even got started. But what hurts me is the bad sequel.
Yes.
Because now to know that the worst ones are like the Disney ones, because my kids love Disney movies, or did when they were younger. The Disney movie, like, I don't know, like Lilo and Stitch, right, will be like, this is this girl learning to love her sister and growing as a person, doing all these things. And then the sequel's like, oh, and then the next day, she hated her sister again, and the alien went bad again. And it's like, you look at all the progress they made, everything they gained in that story is thrown out in order to recreate the formula. Or, the Alien franchise, just seeing the shit that Ripley's character goes through, or like what they did at the start of Alien 3, right? Where they just kill
off some of your favorite characters off screen, just it doesn't matter.
You have a whole movie about saving this girl Newt and the mother-daughter relationship, and then it's like, oh, it was she died.
It's literally just on script. It's just, and Newt is dead. And you're like, whoa.
Yeah. So that stuff's definitely more upsetting to me, I think, because it's easier. I mean, it's easier for me to discount Prometheus than it is the other stuff. But,
I think for me, there's only... I'm the exact same. I think the prequels generally don't work for a bunch of reasons. And one of the other reasons is that you generally always know the outcome. You've already kind of... It's like the... Star Wars being the perfect example, you knew Darth Vader or Anakin Skywalker was going to turn to Darth Vader. You knew what was going to happen. So there was no stakes, really. There was no real stakes in it because you had an idea. The one game that I think that's actually kind of solved the prequel problem or done it really well, I felt, was Red Dead Redemption 2, because it brought in so many characters that you kind of went, I don't know, like these people aren't in the other games, so I don't know what happens to them, and I actually grow to care about them, and so I don't want them to die. So,
which they did, and I haven't watched all of this, but like the Breaking Bad prequel, played with that because you knew where he was getting to, but they introduced entirely new characters. So you're like, well, what's going to happen to this character? But also because it wasn't necessarily the main character as well, like they set up different arcs where you were intrigued as to how they get to where they're going to. But then they also cheated with Breaking Bad because they had the flash forward to what was happening after it, right? And so I think if you expand your fiction sideways, and certainly different types of stories, I think so Origins was I didn't feel comfortable, and I've been involved in a few projects. Some of them didn't come out, where you'd be given someone else's IP or toys to play with, and that was definitely a case where I just didn't feel comfortable. Like they created these weird, wonderful games, and it didn't feel like it was our place to come in. And so certainly when we then made Shattered Memories, which at some point was an entirely unique entry. And this is like another crazy cowboy thing that we'd been talking about doing this Silent Hill game on Wii, and we had some ideas for a while, but it wasn't being signed, and we weren't being given the green light. And the producer there, same producer that did the Silent Hill UMDs and everything else, pointed out that I believe, at least how it was explained to me, like they have some approvals database within Konami, right, where it needs to be signed off by Japan, and once you have the green light from Japan, you can go. because they had this earlier discussion about doing a remake of Silent Hill 1 that they had decided they couldn't do, this existed in the system as having been greenlit. So he was like, if we call this a Silent Hill remake, we can just start tomorrow. So let's do that.
Amazing.
When he said that, I thought about it for 5 seconds, and I was like, well, at this point, the movie existed. And the movie was, an attempt, not a terrible attempt, to not even scrub off the sharp edges, but like put dialogue in people's mouths that would work for a movie, and just do something, flesh it out in that way. And some people loved it, some people had issues, but it existed. We had done Silent Hill Origins, which was in many ways, as I've said, like a retread of the locations, characters, atmosphere of Silent Hill 1. So we were like, where do you, there's no fresh new ground to be covered for us in just making this a Silent Hill 1 remake.
Yeah.
And I hadn't watched it, but I knew that everyone really loved the Battlestar Galactica reboot that was on TV. And I knew that it was essentially a brand new story, but using the same character names, where they'd switched genders and moved things around, and it was a very different tone, and everyone loved it. So I was like, hey, this sounds sexy. Let's do the Battlestar Galactica of Silent Hill. And everyone was like, yeah, that sounds cool.
Everyone in the meetings is just like, yes.
We had this story, like the story we were working on prior to that was a lot, it had this idea of the framing device of the psychiatrist, and it was about memories and perspective and things. So we already had like these ideas of like false memories or perspective. So the idea of actually making the game this weird misremembered riff on Silent Hill actually was exciting to me creatively, because I was like, oh, we can actually play with that. I also, this is my opinion, but like I wasn't a huge fan of Silent Hill 3. Like I loved 2, which is, not... everyone loves 2, so it's not like I'm being clever there. But I didn't like that 3 went back to the cult plot line, and I didn't like a lot of the gameplay choices in Silent Hill 3. And I didn't like... I think it was maybe the bad ending. I hate multiple endings in games anyway, because I always get the sucky ending and then don't have the wherewithal or the energy to go back.
And get
but I think like the bad ending in Silent Hill 3, correct me if I'm wrong, is Heather. There's the detective character with the amazing face.
Douglas, yeah.
And she pulls a knife on him, and it's implied she's going to kill him,
and that
she's possessed or something. Yeah. And I kind of hated I didn't like that. I didn't like it just... Again, people love Silent Hill 3, and it's its own thing, and I respect that. But I like the cheapness of, you get this bad ending where she's turned evil, and I didn't like that. And part of my mind, I was like trying to reclaim that. So there is an intentional thread through Shattered Memories that is taking that instance of grown-up Cheryl attacking a private detective with a knife, and it's addressed in the story in Shattered Memories. And so there's this thread running through Shattered Memories of Silent Hill 1, the bad ending there, which is the ending I got, because again, I didn't have the wherewithal to replay and get the good ending. How would you explain this idea that this 7-year-old girl is the cause of all this supernatural disturbance, all these magical powers,
the Omen effect.
The bad ending of Silent Hill 1, spoilers, but it's an old game, is that Harry Mason died in a car crash. So I was like pulling all this together. I was like, well, a 7-year-old girl whose dad dies in a car crash, maybe she would explain everything that happened in her life as this dark supernatural conspiracy and have all these ideas. And maybe that girl would grow up to be troubled and attack this private detective. And so there was this element of trying to not touch on their mythology or their games or screw with their storyline, but create this brand new story that for me was pulling in my response to a lot of the other games, whilst telling this entirely new story that for me was interesting about the relationship between this girl and her father. So yeah, we kind of when they threw the remake thing at us, we found a way to make it very cool for ourselves. You know, the idea of prequeling Silent Hill 1 with Travis Grady was not something we loved. Yeah. But here, it's like, we can own this and be 100% happy morally and creatively with what we're doing. And
it's interesting because it's one of those, when people talk about remakes or reboots within gaming, it's one that often gets cited as a good example because it did that thing of not trying to recreate it beat for beat and, you know, just... I mean, I would compare it, I think, in a similar way, like the Resident Evil remake from 2002 would be a similar example where it's not just... It doesn't just... It's not doing the exact same things all over again. It's telling elements of those stories, but in a completely new way. And I'll say that, like, as I said to you, Silent Hill Shattered Memories is one of my personal favourites. And I think at the time that I played it, I was going through a lot of stuff myself. And having those psychiatrist moments, as silly as they might be in that they're in a game and it's just, you know, it still felt helpful. Like, you felt like you're a character who is troubled, and so then if you are troubled in what you're going through in life at that time, you latch to that, you relate so heavily that you feel like you are going through your own struggle and getting the help and stuff. And I mean, I'll tell you a quick story that you told your story about the kind of wild, eccentric American that you went to work for. In 2012, I got hired by a firm in Dublin, and they were making a sentiment analysis game. So they hired me to come on as their community manager, and I was brought up to Dublin, and I got paid a lot of money, more than I've ever been in my entire life, and lived in a beautiful apartment in the best part of Dublin. It was all paid for. But I was working for this really shady company that was trying to, like, steal people's data. And they were asking me, like, what other games, like, read people and, like, you know, try to evaluate them. And I cited 2 games at the time. I said, well, like, Silent Hill Shattered Memories asks you kind of questions and you've to kind of give it information. And I was like, and Catherine, they're the 2 games that jump out to me in 2012 that actually asked you questions that seem to actually be about you, the player, and not the character. And so I had to write this whole article for their site that was about how sentiment analysis could be used in gaming because of these games. And it felt so bad because I was like, I love these games. I don't want to be using them to try and mine people's fucking data. Like, are you serious? But that they basically did a massive tax scam on the Irish government and fled country, and we were left in Dublin just kind of going, okay, so now that they're gone, we can't afford this $3,000 a month apartment anymore. But it was, I just remember though that, as I say, Silent Hill Shattered Memories and Catherine, they were games that taught me. I was a dev at that time. They made me start to think to myself, this is what I would like to do. I would like to ask questions of people, or, like, you know, create kind of morally grey situations that, you know, that you, the player, have to put a bit of yourself into. You can't just expect the game to hand you everything. You have to give something back in return. And that's still something that I'm playing around with. There's a game that I've wanted to make since 2012 that is very much in that vein. And due to lockdown, I've reconnected with developers that I used to work with back in 2010, 2011. And we're kind of like, look, we're all stuck at home now. Why don't we try and tackle this thing maybe? If, you know... But I think that for me was the moment where I realised that you could marry interactive fiction into a traditional games design to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things for me at that time was realising, and maybe some perverse part did come from the fact that, my first job was working for this business intelligence company where they were doing the shit where it was like, we mine everyone's credit card data and can see that there is an affinity for babies' nappies and beer because young parents, you know, treat themselves because they're like, you know, life is hard. So they would put, the beer on the same aisle as the nappies and stuff and do all this stuff. So I'd live through that. But for me, like, the crazy thing was, video games absorb so much information from just the act of being played, even if you're not even asking questions. And we never did anything interesting with it. And even to the point of like scripting, 99% of things that happen in a video game still to this day are triggered based on your character colliding with a giant invisible box.
Yeah.
Right. So, we had a few points in Shattered Memories where if you looked somewhere, like we know where you're pointing the camera. We know what you're interested in. And so at that point, I looked into like eye tracking studies and like what people were doing with eye tracking. It was like, this seems very useful. And because we were a horror game, psychological horror game, we were supposed to be screwing with people's heads and making people uncomfortable. And there were a few elements that justified this as well. In Silent Hill 2, there were 2 or 3 points, maybe more, where the game tracks things you don't realize you're being tracked for. There's a genius bit where you're walking down a corridor, and as you walk down the corridor, a flashback plays where you hear James having an argument with his wife. It's a linear corridor. It takes, let's say, 30 seconds to walk down this corridor and get to the end. There's nothing else to do in it. It's a nondescript corridor. The conversation lasts for 50 seconds. So they tracked, do you just carry on regardless, or do you stop to listen to the conversation? They tracked how many times you looked at your wife's letter in your inventory. There were like all these little variables they were checking. For that game, it influenced the ending you got. That was it. Like, it changed whether you got a happy or sad ending. But I was like, this, to me, is what is super interesting about gaming. Like, if you, and again, like saying the idea of a game that's taking something from its player, that it's not just saying anyone could be playing this thing.
Yeah. Right.
It's you sat there in front of it, and the game's confronting you a little bit and taking something from you. And so, a lot of the game was us going, well, the thing that was in everyone's mind was the fact that the psychiatrist asks you explicit questions, or in some cases gives you little games to play that are slightly more analog.
Crayons,
you're still asserting something that, like, there was some of that was like an interesting challenge for us, because you have all these projective tests, I think they call them, in psychiatry, where they'll say, draw me a picture of a house, or they'll show you a photo and say, what emotion is this person feeling, right? And they're all tests designed to have people project their own state onto these characters. So we had fun figuring out, how do you put that in a game? So, there was somewhere you had to like put cards that were of dead people and cards that were of sleeping people, or something, like coming up with ways to do this. But actually 90% of the data the game got on you came from outside of those sessions. So you enter the forest, do you walk along the path, or do you go off piste? When you enter a room, do you check every drawer, or do you just keep going? What things are you looking at? So we had like this gaze tracking thing running constantly, that because especially of the Wii, you looked more organically with the Wii. So we could actually detect the difference between like someone seeing a thing, like acknowledging it existed, but carrying on, versus seeing a thing and then going, what is that? We were tracking all that. When you're with a character, you're walking along with Michelle. Do you look at Michelle, or are you looking at the world around you? Do you use your phone to try and call characters in between meeting them and stuff? So we had all of that data. So we just had all this information telling us what people were doing. And the biggest, certainly the most controversial feature in terms of budget, was we had all this branched content that, normally in a D&D RPG kind of game, you would have explicit choices. Will you kill the peasant or save the peasant? Are you going to steal this thing, or are you going to, all those kind of little branching choices. And what we did in our game was, every time you got to a cutscene, every time you got to a new location, every time you met a character, we thought, what are the interesting different versions of this we can do? Like a character like Michelle Valdez was intended as being like your best friend. She was your friend on the journey. She was not the femme fatale kind of character that Dahlia was. She was going to be like your buddy helping solve this mystery.
Yeah.
So I think the psychology there maybe said she should be like the player. And so we were like, well, we're going to meet this character in this empty school hall. Harry has gone there because the town is shut down, but he's heard that this is like an emergency meeting point. So if his lost daughter has gone wandering, maybe she'll have ended up there. He gets there and it's deserted. And this character, Michelle, has come because she came back to town for her high school reunion. And she showed up here, but everyone's, it's deserted. There's no one there. So that scene was like broken up into lots of little pieces. You had like an opening shot, just like first impressions. Then you had a chunk where she is introduced to Harry. And then you had like this longer chunk that was exposition. And we had like an extroverted version of Michelle where she sings this song on the stage to the room and is very forthcoming. And she jumps into Harry's arms and he feels awkward. And then there was the introverted version of Michelle. She sat on a stool singing it to herself, this kind of more acoustic version. And then when she sees that there's someone else in the room, she's incredibly embarrassed that she's been caught singing. And she kind of awkwardly climbs down. Once that's happened, this third segment, the exposition, plays out exactly the same because the ice has been broken. So the difference between those two versions of the character aren't as important. And then once that's happened, you then, I think you go into like the principal's office because you want to get some information. We had a version where you were both conscious that the idea of breaking into the principal's office was some kind of transgression against authority, and that was significant. And so they're both kind of like, oh, we're being a bit naughty here as they do it. There was another version where the door is just unlocked and they just walk through the door. And I think Michelle like gives the finger to the desk where the principal secretary would sit. And extrovert or introvert versions could have either of those because we picked them for different reasons. So we kind of would always create this modular version of a scene, and we could change the set dressing in the school hall. So there's a version where it's set up to look more like a wedding for people that are really digging into this theme of Harry and his wife and their failed relationship. Michelle had different costumes and hairstyles that would fit with the different types of personality. And once you've met, say, extrovert Michelle in the hot red dress, that's the Michelle you know, and later on she might express dialogue that's slightly different. But this kind of composite version we've created in your head is the version of Michelle that you know, and you kind of fill in all the blanks. So that was like super interesting to me, was this idea that a game can take all this data, and then as a storyteller, I can use it to calibrate my story, just as I would if I was sat opposite you and was improvising a story.
So there you have it, folks. That was the first part of my interview with the incredible Sam Barlow. As you saw in this video, for a person like me that never shuts up, to stay this quiet and just listen to what Sam is saying is incredible. But this guy has just such an incredible knack for storytelling, and also just being able to share his experience, his wisdom, his knowledge, and I just drank it all in, and I hope you guys got as much from it as I did. Episode 2 will be up very soon. By the time you're watching this video, it could already be up, so make sure to check out. If it is, there will be a card up at that time, and I urge you to just watch it, because I love the reason that this ended up being a two-parter is because I couldn't cut any of it out. Sam is too fantastic, and his stories are incredible, especially about stuff like Untitled Chapter Memories, which is a huge favourite of mine. But then in the next episode, we talk about his amazing triple BAFTA winning Her Story, Telling Lies, and also his upcoming project Ambrosia, as it's been christened on Steam, but it's Project A and then Redacted. So I cannot wait to share that episode with you, or as I say, it could already be available. This is the joy of putting these end pieces onto the videos. But look, if you like what you saw here, please make sure and follow Sam in the links in the description below to keep up to date with all that he's doing. And also, please hit the like and subscribe button. Stick around here for all that we got coming. We've done interviews with writers like Larry Fessenden and Graham Resnick, who worked on Until Dawn, developers like Michelle Giannone, who created Daymare 1998, voice actors like Nick Apostolides, who was Leon in Resident Evil 2 Remake, and Rob Wiedoff, who was the incredible John Marston in Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2. So yeah, there's so much here to check out. Please make sure and do so. And thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next one. As I say at the end of every video, let's survive together, and peace out.